Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're jumping right into a really core conflict in global energy planning.
hmm
How do you actually hit that huge goal, 100% renewable energy, but at the same time really hammer down the total system costs?
It's the classic optimization problem, isn't it?
Exactly. And today we're going to discover the answer might not lie in some massive policy change, but actually in a very specific, almost mechanical decision.
Right, about how we physically mount our solar panels.
It seems small, but the impacts are huge.
Yeah, it's a perfect example of how these granular engineering choices can ripple right out into global economic and infrastructure planning.
So it's not just high-level policy talk.
No, not at all. It's about optimizing the actual hardware on the ground. And this entire deep dive, it's built on the analysis from a really important study called Relevance of PV with single-axis tracking for energy scenarios.
Okay, relevance of PV with single-axis tracking. Let's unpack this for you. So when we talk about these big utility-scale solar installations, the massive solar farms out in the desert or fields, the planners basically have a choice. They usually go for either fixed tilted panels, these just stay facing one direction, set at an angle forever.
But that's the most common image people have, I think.
Right. Or they can use single-axis tracking systems.
Yeah.
And we're focusing specifically on the ones oriented along a horizontal north-south axis.
Okay, and what do those do differently?
Well, they actually follow the sun, moving from east to west throughout the day.
Got it. And here's the sort of the gap or the problem this study really tackles.
Yeah.
Almost all the major global energy system models,
Yeah.
The big complex ones governments and major companies use to predict the future grid.
The planning tools.
Exactly. Historically, they've pretty much ignored that single-axis tracking option.
Really? Why?
Well, they tend to default their huge scenario planning exercises to the simpler fixed-tilt design, maybe for modeling simplicity initially.
But by doing that, they might actually be skewing their own projections, right?
That's the core argument. They're essentially leaving out a technology that, in the real world, already has a significant market share.
Okay, so the mission of this study was to specifically look at that, to investigate the impact of actually including this single-axis tracking PV option in the models.
Precisely. So they modeled two different pathways, both aiming for 100% renewable energy by 2030.
Ambitious goal.
Very. And both scenarios were optimized to find the lowest total annual system cost, using this advanced tool called the LUT Energy System Model.
And the key difference between the two.
Scenario 1 only allowed the standard, optimally fixed tilted PV.
Okay.
Scenario 2 allowed both, optimally fixed tilted and the single-axis tracking PV. So just adding the option.
And the teaser, the initial findings, sounds like it made a big difference.
Oh, yeah. Dramatic conclusion.
Yeah.
Even just allowing that sort of slightly different technology completely shifts the optimal global energy mix. It leads to significant cost reductions. And it actually changes how much expensive infrastructure, like transmission lines and batteries, we might need.
Wow. So a better mechanical platform drives a whole system reoptimization.
That's the idea. We should probably give a bit of context on PV first, though.
Good point. Solar PV is obviously huge now.
It's already one of the main pillars of the future grid. And its growth has just been explosive.
The numbers are pretty staggering, aren't they?
Yeah, think about this. The global annual installation rate jumped from around 29 gigawatts a year to nearly 100 gigawatts a year back in 2016.
So the total amount installed by then was already massive.
Over 400 gigawatts globally by the end of 2016. And of course, those numbers have just kept climbing steeply since then.
And a big driver for that incredible deployment is cost, right? Solar keeps getting cheaper.
Absolutely. The data totally backs that up. PV system prices, they've dropped with an average learning rate that's the cost reduction for every doubling of capacity of about 21% over recent decades.
And even faster recently.
Yeah, it accelerated to an average of 39% over the last 10 years or so leading up to the study. Cost is definitely driving deployment.
But performance is what drives optimization, which brings us back to tracking.
Exactly. So why bother with moving parts? Why add that complexity?
Yeah, what's the benefit?
The fundamental technical benefit is simply more energy. It's the yield.
Okay.
Because that single-axis tracking system rotates, follows the sun across the sky. It typically increases the annual energy yield by a really substantial amount. We're talking 25% to 30% more energy production compared to the identical fixed tilted layout.
Wow, 25 to 30% more energy from the same basic panels just by moving them.
Pretty much, yeah. It's a significant boost.
Okay, that's a huge number.
Yeah.
But for a study like this to be credible, especially making global claims, the modeling has to be really solid.
Absolutely critical, especially when you're dealing with intermittent sources like solar and wind for a 100% renewable system.
So what makes the methodology here robust?
Well, the rigor is high. They use satellite-based global data, and crucially, it had very fine resolution, temporally down to the hour,
Okay.
and spatially, a grid of 0.45 by 0.45 degrees. That level of detail is absolutely essential to accurately capture the variability, the ups and downs of solar and wind generation across different times and different places.
And what about validating the tracking system performance itself within the model?
Right, they needed to be sure those inputs were accurate.
Hmm.
So the specific model they used to estimate the annual yield from the trackers
Yeah.
was carefully validated against a well-known industry standard software package called PVSYST.
Okay, I've heard of that.
Yeah, it's widely used.
Yeah.
And the simulation results from their model lined up very closely. They were within a tight 4% margin of the PVSYST results.
So that gives confidence that the technical assumptions about the trackers are sound for this large-scale modeling.
Exactly. Good validation work.
All right, let's dive into the core finding then. The shift in the optimal energy mix. We've got the two scenarios, both aiming for 100% renewables by 2030, both cost optimized. What technologies ended up dominating?
Well, first off, in both scenarios, the results confirmed what many other studies show. PV and wind power overwhelmingly emerge as the dominant generation technologies globally.
Okay, so that basic premise holds. A 100% RE system based mainly on solar and wind looks technically viable and low cost in either case.
Right, it reaffirms that core belief.
But allowing tracking in scenario 2 really threw a wrench in the works, didn't it? It rebalanced the roles of solar and wind quite dramatically.
It really did. The availability of tracking technology shifted the optimized global mix heavily towards solar PV.
How much of a shift are we talking?
Get this, the global generation share of PV, the percentage of all electricity coming from solar increased from 47% in the fixed-only scenario to 59% when tracking was allowed.
Wow, from 47% to 59%. That's, let me see, like a 25% jump in solar's total contribution?
Yeah, a 25.3% increase in its share, simply because a more efficient version of PV was available to the optimization model.
And I'm guessing that these single-axis tracking systems, the new option introduced, made up a big part of that increase.
A very big part. Single-axis tracking PV alone accounted for a full 20% of total electricity generation in that optimized scenario, too.
20% of all global electricity from tracking PV alone.
Yep. It shows that when you optimize for system cost, the higher yield you get from tracking makes it incredibly competitive on a global scale.
Okay, so if solar jumps up that much in its share of generation, something else has to give, right? What happened to wind power, traditionally seen as solar's essential partner?
Wind definitely took the substitution hit. The share of wind energy, and this was primarily onshore wind, it decreased substantially. It dropped from 31% of total generation down to just 21%.
31 down to 21%, that's a huge drop, like a third of its contribution gone.
It's a 33.9% reduction in wind's generation share, yeah. The optimized system is clearly choosing the higher yield, better profile solar option whenever it makes economic sense geographically.
That represents a massive rethink for global infrastructure planning. If the optimized cheapest system prefers tracking solar over wind in so many places, how does that affect the actual amount of stuff we need to build? The installed capacity numbers must show a big swing, too.
Oh, absolutely. The capacity figures reflect this shift directly. Overall, the total installed PV capacity actually increases by about 16.8%.
Okay, more solar overall.
Right. That represents about 1,738 gigawatts of new solar needed, and it's all allocated to the utility scale segment in the model.
But wait, if the total goes up, what happens to the less efficient fixed-tilt PV?
Ah, good question. While total PV capacity goes up, the required capacity of the optimally fixed tilted PV is simultaneously reduced by a whopping 28.5%.
So it's swapping out fixed for tracking.
Effectively, yes.
Yeah.
Almost 2,000 gigawatts of fixed tilt capacity are substituted out in favor of tracking in the optimized scenario.
And the impact on wind capacity must be equally stark then.
It is. Onshore wind capacity gets slashed by 35.9%.
Wow.
That's a reduction of over 1,200 gigawatts of wind turbines compared to the scenario without tracking PV.
So this really highlights the economic competition between different renewables when you model them accurately.
Exactly. When tracking PV is on the table, the system often prefers it, leading to this massive decrease in the required infrastructure for both fixed-tilt solar and especially wind.
Let's shift to the system-wide effects then, because the economic payoff, the bottom line, that's often what drives policy
For
decisions.
sure.
What was the key financial finding for the global system cost?
I think the most significant number for you to remember is the reduction in the overall cost of electricity. The global average levelized cost of electricity, the LCOE.
Right, the true lifetime cost.
Yeah, basically the true cost per unit of energy generated. That decreased by 6.1% globally when tracking was allowed.
6.1%. How much is that in actual numbers?
It moved down from 54.8 euros per megawatt hour to 51.4 euros per megawatt hour. And the total annual levelized cost for the entire global system was reduced by a very similar amount, 6.0%.
A 6% system cost reduction globally? Just by allowing tracking panels. That seems incredibly significant for such a specific technology choice.
It really is. And importantly, that cost reduction wasn't just because the trackers produce more energy per panel.
Oh, what else contributed?
It was also driven by major operational efficiencies across the entire grid infrastructure. Things worked better together.
How so? What line of efficiencies?
Well, the system becomes more efficient, partly because the generation profile from tracking PV is better suited to match daily demand patterns.
Okay.
This means less wasted energy overall, and crucially, less need for expensive infrastructure to move and store that energy.
Less waste, like curtailment, when there's too much power.
Exactly. Curtailment, that excess renewable electricity the grid sometimes can't absorb, was reduced by 14.6%. That's nearly 300 terawatt hours less wasted energy annually.
And I remember seeing something about transmission too. Less need for power lines.
Correct. The need for power transmission between different regions dropped by 22.2%. That's huge.
Yeah.
537 terawatt hours less electricity needing to be shipped around.
Which also means less energy lost in those lines.
You got it. Grid losses dropped correspondingly by 23.3%. Less movement, less loss.
This all sounds fantastic, but here comes the part that seems a bit counterintuitive.
Ah, yes. The storage aspect.
Right. Logically, if you're adding substantially more solar generation to the global mix, and solar is still intermittent, right? Sun doesn't shine at night.
Correct.
You'd think that means we need more battery storage to soak up all that extra daytime generation for later use. But this study found the opposite.
It did, and this is perhaps one of the most powerful insights from modeling the tracking technology properly.
Okay, explain this battery paradox.
The system actually needed less utility-scale battery storage capacity. The demand for battery capacity was reduced by 8.5%, about 988 gigawatt hours less storage needed.
Less storage despite more solar. How does that work?
It works because single-axis tracking provides a much better daily generation profile compared to fixed tilt.
What do you mean by profile?
Fixed tilt panels, they generate most intensely right around solar noon, giving you a sharp peak. Tracking panels, because they follow the sun, start generating more power early in the morning and continue generating more power later in the afternoon.
Ah, so they spread the generation out more across the day.
Exactly. And that spread, that broader shoulder of generation, happens to match typical human electricity demand patterns, those morning and afternoon peaks, much more closely.
I see. So because the generation timing better matches the demand timing, less energy needs to be stored from the midday peak to cover those shoulder periods.
You got it. We're not just chasing the total annual energy produced. We're optimizing the quality and timing of that production relative to when people actually use electricity.
And that means less need for massive, expensive battery farms.
That's the key takeaway here. Solar technology, specifically tracking, that provides a better operational profile, fundamentally reduces the required investment in grid balancing infrastructure like batteries.
Okay, that makes sense now. What about other types of storage or balancing systems? Did shifting from wind to solar have other consequences?
It did have a couple of knock-on effects. When you substitute wind generation with PV, even tracking PV, you do slightly increase the need for seasonal storage.
Okay, why is that?
Wind patterns often complement solar seasonally, more wind in winter, for instance. So relying more heavily on solar means a slightly bigger gap to fill across seasons. This resulted in gas storage needs increasing slightly by 2.2%.
And what about meeting those really sharp, infrequent peak demands?
Right, for those very high peaks that even batteries might not cover efficiently, the model showed an increase in open-cycle gas turbine, or OCGT, installations. Those went up at about 32.3%. They run infrequently but provide that peak power.
Got it. And did tracking impact power-to-gas systems at all, the ones making synthetic gas from excess electricity?
Yes, positively. Another benefit. The smoother, more consistent generation profile from the tracking PV allowed those power-to-gas, or PTG systems, to operate more consistently.
Meaning they run for more hours.
Exactly. They achieved higher full load hours, or FLH. And since PTG systems are very capital intensive, running them for more hours per year makes them significantly more economical. Better utilization of an expensive asset.
Okay, this all paints a compelling picture, but we need to talk geography. Tracking isn't going to be equally effective everywhere on Earth, is it?
No, definitely not. Location matters a lot. The performance varies significantly with latitude and local climate.
So where does tracking perform best?
The yield gain, that extra energy boost, is strongest in the sunniest regions, as you'd expect. We're talking gains of 30% to 35% in areas with really high global horizontal irradiation, or GHI, and crucially, not much diffuse light, meaning less cloud cover.
Like where specifically?
Think places like the Sahara Desert, large parts of the Arab Peninsula, coastal Brazil, Australia. Those are the real sweet spots for tracking.
Okay, and what about as you move away from the equator into more moderate climates?
Well, in regions with more moderate sunshine levels, maybe like Central Europe or parts of Canada, the gain from tracking is still noticeable, but it's more moderate, maybe in the 10 to 15% range.
Still potentially worthwhile, though.
Potentially, yes. But this study also flags important regional exceptions. There are places where fixed tilt is still the better, cheaper option.
Where would that be?
Generally, in very high latitude regions, think Alaska, the UK, most of Russia.
Why not there?
In those locations, the angle of the sun is lower, the days are shorter in winter, and there's often more diffuse light. The extra energy yield you get from tracking is just too small to justify the added cost and mechanical complexity of the tracking system itself. Fixed makes more sense.
So it's not a universal solution, but globally, the overall message for energy planners seems incredibly strong.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The conclusion from this study is really unambiguous. Energy system modeling, especially for future 100% RE scenarios, must explicitly include single-axis tracking PV as an option.
And if they don't?
If they neglect it, they risk severely underestimating the true potential and optimal share of solar PV in the future energy mix.
Which leads to other distortions.
Right. Consequently, it leads modelers to overestimate the necessary contribution from wind power, and it unnecessarily inflates the overall projected system costs. They end up planning for a more expensive system than necessary.
Okay, let's try to summarize the really powerful findings from this deep dive then.
Go for it.
Simply allowing the use of single-axis tracking PV in the optimization models for a 100% renewable future resulted in, number one, a substantial 6% reduction in global system costs.
Significant savings.
Number two, it boosted solar's overall share of electricity generation by about 25%.
Making PV even more dominant.
And number three, it significantly reduced the need for expensive system infrastructure, particularly utility-scale battery storage and long-distance transmission lines.
Yeah, it really makes a compelling data-driven case for paying attention to technological specifics in our large-scale energy planning. It's not just about if we use solar, but how.
This has been our deep dive into the insights from Relevance of TV with single-axis tracking for energy scenarios.
And maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over.
Yeah.
This study really reveals something quite profound, I think. It suggests that the quality of solar generation, specifically defined by its ability to closely match the daily load profile, which is what tracking helps provide.
Right, the timing aspect.
Exactly. That quality or profile might actually be a more critical factor in optimizing our future grid storage needs than simply maximizing the sheer quantity of solar capacity we install.
So focusing on how solar generates throughout the day, not just the total amount per year.
Precisely. And that subtle shift in focus from just volume to include the generation profile could be the next really important area for policymakers and investors to explore as they design and build that 100% renewable grid. It's about smarter solar, not just more solar.